Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Sophie in the Saddle by Dick King Smith. Chapter 2, Jolly Brave. Apart from that first mistake, Puddle did not live up to his name. By the time Sophie and the boys went back to school after the Christmas holidays, he was pretty well house-trained. This was largely due to Sophie's efforts. She watched Puddle like a hawk, and the moment he seemed restless or showed any sign of being about to lower himself towards the floor, she scooped him up and put him out in the garden. All this, in turn, was thanks to Sophie's Aunt Al. Aunt Al was really the children's great-great-aunt, but she was also Sophie's great-great friend. She was nearly 82 years old, but extremely young at heart, and she lived in the Highlands, a mysterious-sounding land, Sophie always thought, from which the inhabitants peered down at the rest of the world far below. It was Aunt Al who had fixed it so that Sophie was allowed to keep a stray black cat, at first called Tom, but later, after giving birth to 4 kittens, renamed Tomboy. It was Aunt Al who now owned one of those kittens, called Ollie. It was Aunt Al who had given Sophie the rabbit Biano. And it was Aunt Al who telephoned a couple of days after Christmas. Sophie answered the phone. "It's Aunt Al," she said. "She's ringing down from the Highlands." "Ringing up, you mean?" said her father. Sophie sighed. "Oh, Daddy," she said. Sophie, in common with a great-great-aunt, liked to speak her mind, but she was wary of telling her father that he was mouldy, stupid, and assive. But really, how could you ring up from the top of the Highlands? "She wants to speak to you, I expect," said Sophie. "Who's she? The cat's mother?" said a sharp voice at the other end. "It's you I want to speak to, Sophie." "Oh, you've got a nice surprise, didn't you?" "Oh, yes. Puddle, you mean?" "Is that what the puppy's called?" "Yes," said Sophie. "That's what I'm ringing you about," said Aunt Al. "I know he's meant to be the family's pet, but your father has his work, and your mother has the house to look after, and the boys won't be the slightest use, always off playing football. So you're going to have to be the dog trainer, Sophie. He's too young to be taught a lot of things yet, but you must get him house-trained. I'll tell you what to do." And she did. "And if he slips up," said Aunt Al, "don't let anyone shout at him or rub his nose in it. He won't understand. Oh, and by the way, soda water's good for the carpet." The conversation ended in their usual no-nonsense way. "Got it?" "Yes." "Okay. Ollie sends his love." "Right. Bye." "Bye." Sophie put the phone down. Clink. "What was all that about?" asked her mother. Sophie did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "Mum, when was I clean?" "Clean? Potty trained, you mean?" "Yes." "Oh, about 2. 2 months?" 2 years. "Yikes!" said Sophie. She picked up the puppy and went out into the garden and put him down on the lawn. Now then, my dear, she said, you haven't even got 2 weeks before I go back to school, so you'd better get a move on. And when he did, she said, you are clever. Meow, said a voice, and Tomboy came to rub against her legs. Puddle immediately made a bumbling rush at the cat and received a sharp cuff round the ear. Meow, said Tomboy, or that's what it sounded like, and stalked off. Come and see Biano, Sophie said. He won't hurt you. Biano lived in a large hutch in the potting shed, where once, when younger, Sophie had kept her flocks and herds of woodlice, worms, centipedes, earwigs, slugs, and snails. He was a large white rabbit with floppy ears and pink eyes and a whiffly nose. He had never been in the least afraid of Tomboy, and now when Sophie opened the hutch door and put him down on the floor beside the puppy, he thumped with his hind legs and gave such a threatening growl that Puddle's small tail went between his legs. Nobody loves you, my dear, Sophie said, except your trainer. By the end of the school holidays, Puddle had learned a lot. Not to do things or chew things in the house, not to tangle with cats or rabbits, to answer to his name, to walk after a fashion, on a lead beside Sophie, wearing Biano's old blue collar. Sophie got up early on the first day of the new term and dressed grey pleated skirt, grey shirt, striped tie, maroon cardigan. At first she had hated her school uniform, but now she was used to it, and by the time she had attended to all her animals, no one would have guessed that her clothes had been clean a mere half-hour before. Her dark hair looked, as always, as though she had just come through a hedge backwards. Looking forward to school, Sophie? Her father said at breakfast. Sort of, Sophie said. She quite liked school and was interested in some of the things they taught her. It was just a pity there were no farming lessons, nor did they allow you to bring pets. You will look after Puddle properly, Mum, won't you? She said. Of course I will. He's still only amateur, you see. Amateur? Yes, you know, young. Oh, you mean immature, her mother said. An infant, said Matthew. Like Sophie, said Mark. For Sophie, of course, was still in the infants' class, while the twins were juniors. And all her little friends, said Matthew. Like Duncan, said Mark. Duncan was a small, fat boy whom Sophie had once considered employing as a farm worker at some time in the future. He's a Wally, said Sophie. And Dawn, said Matthew. Yuck, said Sophie. Dawn was a pretty little girl, with golden hair done in bunches. Sophie had often been tempted to give her a bunch of fives. They did not get on. And Andrew, said Mark. Sophie fancies Andrew. They giggled. Sophie's face darkened, but before she could utter her usual comment, her father said, Wonder if they've sold the other 5 pups. Sophie forgot about her brother's teasing and looked thoughtful. "Suppose there was just one left," she said. "All alone?" "No, Sophie," said her father firmly. "We are not having any more animals in this house." That evening, Sophie lay in the bath, playing with a very lifelike rubber frog. Puddle sat on the bath mat, whining. Perhaps on account of his name, he seemed to love water. He liked to jump in any pools left lying after the rain, and he longed to join Sophie in the bath. School had been much as Sophie had expected. Dawn was just as yucky. Duncan was just as much of a wally. Andrew was just as nice, and they still didn't give farming lessons. Lucy's other puppies had all been sold, Andrew told her, but he had asked her and Puddle to tea next Saturday, which was nice. Or rather, Sophie had told Andrew to ask his mother to ask them, which she did. Sophie squeezed the rubber frog's stomach, and it let out a loud squeak, much to Puddle's excitement. Her mother came into the bathroom in time to hear Sophie say, "This is a frog, and he's amphibious." "He's amphibious," her mother said. "That's what I said," replied Sophie, launching the frog back into the water. "Wish I could swim," she said. "Can you swim?" she said to Andrew next Saturday as they went on a tour of the farmyard, Andrew leading, Sophie plodding behind, Puddle following. "Yes, course I can," said Andrew, his stock answer. If Sophie had asked whether he could fly, the reply would probably have been the same. "I'm a brilliant swimmer, I am," he said. "Matthew and Mark can swim like fishes," Sophie said, "but I can't." Just then they came upon the duck pond. It was a large duck pond, and round its rim a number of ducks were standing and preening their feathers. At the sight of them, Puddle ran forward, yapping with excitement, and the ducks, quacking with dismay, took to the water. Puddle leaped in after them. "He'll be drowned!" shouted Sophie, and she jumped in after Puddle. Andrew's father, attracted by all the noise, arrived in time to see a remarkable scene. On the bank, Andrew was rolling about laughing, fit to burst. In the pond, the puppy was swimming round and round with an expert doggy paddle in pursuit of the ducks. Sophie was standing waist deep in the filthy water. "Yuck!" she cried. "I'm stuck in the dug muck." "Andrew's dad pulled me out," Sophie said later at home. "You didn't have sink," said Mark. "You still do," said Matthew. "The first time you went to that farm," Sophie's mother said, "you fell in a cowpat." "Why ever did you jump into the duck pond?" her father said. "I thought Puddle would drown," Sophie said. "I didn't know he could swim." "But you can't, and it might have been deep." "I didn't think of that," Sophie said. Matthew and Mark looked at their small but determined sister. Then they looked at one another. Then, with one voice, they said, "You were jolly brave." Sophie grinned. "Was I?" she said. "One thing's certain," said her father. "It's high time you learned to swim." "And before the end of the summer term too," her mother said. "Why?" said Sophie. "Because we're all going on holiday to the seaside this year." "Yikes!" cried Sophie. "All of us?" "Yes." "Tomboy?" "No." "Piano?" "No." Sophie put on her most determined face. "If Puddle can't go," she said, I'm not coming." "If you learn to swim properly," her father said, "then Puddle can come." "I'll learn," said Sophie.